Today's episode of Backseat's Musical Podcast is brought to you by Canna Provisions. Canna Provisions is an adult-use cannabis dispensary with the largest selection of cannabis products in Western Massachusetts, with locations both in Holyoke and in Lee. They offer a warm, unique shopping experience with guides rather than bud tenders. In fact, they're not just a dispensary, they're a destination. CannaProvisions.com. That's CannaProvisions.com. Adults 21, please, and please consume responsibly. And now, today's episode of Backseat's Musical Podcast with my guest, Steve Hackett from Genesis.
What is it? What is it?
It's Backseat's Musical Podcast.
Once upon a time, long before the band Genesis was cranking out one top 10 hit after another throughout the 1980s, they were a band known for some of the most theatrically visual and technically proficient music of its time. And while Genesis would eventually enjoy a stretch of 6 straight albums that went either platinum or better, it's the early stuff that I prefer. For me, the most satisfying period of the Genesis story was the one that included Peter Gabriel and Steve Hackett. Not that there's anything wrong with that other stuff. It's all great. But go ahead and listen to Supper's Ready from their 1972 album Foxtrot. Go ahead and listen to Firth of Fifth from 1973, Selling England by the Pound. Or maybe you just head right to The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway from 1974. And if you still want to say that Invisible Touch was the best thing that Genesis ever did, then maybe you should seek professional help or get your ears checked, because you would be wrong. From 1970 to 1977, Steve Hackett was the lead guitarist for Genesis. Hackett is one of the most respected guitar players in the world, not just because he played in Genesis. Steve Hackett has also enjoyed a prolific solo career where he has released 27 highly regarded solo records that have influenced everybody from Eddie Van Halen to Brian May of Queen to Alex Lifeson of Rush. This is a guy who was finger-tapping a full half-decade before anyone had even heard of Eddie Van Halen. He was also part of the 1980 supergroup GTR with Steve Howe of Yes. Steve Hackett's musical styles include rock, pop, jazz, blues, classical. He is maybe one of the most insanely diverse guitar talents that there is. The man can do anything, and he has. Steve Hackett is on the road this month where he'll be recreating the 1977 live album by Genesis, Seconds Out, in its entirety. And if you're not familiar with that record, do yourself a favor and fire it up, because it offers the most definitive collection of Steve Hackett-era Genesis songs anywhere. In other words, his show on April 2nd at the Wilbur Theater in Boston is going to be freaking amazing. This is my conversation with the incredibly talented Steve Hackett on Backseat's Musical Podcast. How are you, Steve?
Very good, Mike. How are you doing?
Very good. I've been a fan of Genesis for a long time, and I've always felt that the Peter Gabriel, Steve Hackett era of that band has always been my favorite part in the band's history. So it's a real pleasure to talk to you, so thank you.
Well, the pleasure's all mine, too. Thank you so much for the compliment.
You're going to be in Boston at the Wilbur Theater on April 2nd, and the thing that's really exciting about this, anybody who's a fan of Genesis and that early work, you're actually going to be performing Seconds Out in its entirety. It's a live interpretation of a live album, which is a pretty unique idea.
I know, it's crazy, isn't it? But the thing is that that album, which was done in 1977, was cherry-picking across the whole of the band's history from 1971 onwards. So you get most of the 1970s, the shows that we were doing at that time, so I'm very proud of the album, of all the pieces that were on it, and I love doing the thing in its entirety, and there's also a set of solo things as well. So it's a long show. It comes in about something like the 3-hour mark with a gap in the middle, something like a 20-minute break. So people can go and powder their nose and do what they do. But it's been great. I've taken the show around quite a lot of Europe and the UK now, and I'm kind of on a world tour, so Boston will be part of it, but we take in so many countries this year. We're going everywhere. We're doing Canada, the States, We get to do Japan, Australia, New Zealand. We've done Scandinavia. We've done quite a lot of Europe. We get to go back to Italy, which is fantastic. And it's a privilege to play this stuff with the level of band that I have live.
I spent a lot of time on YouTube preparing for these interviews, and all over the internet for that matter. But one of the things that's been happening a lot lately are these reaction videos, and I've seen a bunch of reaction videos specifically for "Supper's Ready," and the reaction that people have had. And the idea is these are people who have never heard these songs before. But what's remarkable about the reactions is that everybody gets very emotional after hearing it. Like there's something about, there's a bunch of Genesis songs that do that, but Supper's Ready seems to really touch a nerve on people who didn't even realize that Peter Gabriel was even a member of Genesis. I don't know if you had a chance to see it, but it's really very, very cool to see people react to that music in that way.
I have seen some of that, and people who are coming to it for the first time, I think people are surprised at the quality of the writing. So, in a way, Genesis was a bit like a songwriter's school. Whatever you think about, the different eras of the band, it kind of spans the gamut of various genres. So I'm very, very happy with that.
What's interesting about Genesis is, like you talk about, there are different eras of the band, and certainly they had their their wave in the 80s when they were cranking out a bunch of radio-friendly hits. But for many of us fans that precede that time, we've always been just floored by the level of musicianship that Genesis, brought to the table. I mean, there were many bands that did that. Then there was Yes and King Crimson and bands of the time. But when you put it all together and you look at, how great Tony Banks was, I think is a terribly underrated keyboard player, and how brilliant Phil Collins is just as a drummer. Never mind as a vocalist or a songwriter, but just as a drummer. And then there's you, who is an amazing guitarist, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. When you're joining these guys for the very first time, did you realize right away the level of musicianship that you were getting yourself involved in, or was it something you discovered as you went along?
Well, we all started to develop together naturally. You start off as individuals, and then something starts to happen. You start to influence each other. People open up to each other, and a new breed of song comes along. Sometimes extended to include everyone's ideas. Something like Supper's Ready, which you mentioned, of course, which takes up, one half of an album. There's no denying the fact that long form and rock, many people would say, that's indulgent and you can't do that. But then if the quality of the writing is good enough, not only can that work, it can also, take root with classical music. Classical music meets rock, meets all sorts of things, humor, pantomime. But the first time anyone gets to hear it, it's a big surprise. It's music that's full of surprises and changes and dynamics and ambushes and bits of romance. It's not a one-horse trick. So if people like their music to be developed, Genesis, I think, is a very good starting point, particularly 70s Genesis, when it was perhaps less hit singles, but more the journey that an album affords.
When you think of songs like that and albums like that, and you could go through every single one of them, unless you see Peter Gabriel live, maybe you may appreciate him for as a vocalist, but as just a pure showman. That's a guy that has spent his entire career just his live performances stick out. And I know when he played with Genesis, it wasn't just just his own charisma, but he's in costume, he's doing things on stage. The first time you see him do that, what was your reaction? What was the reaction of the band the first time he comes out dressed as a flower?
Well, if I can go a little bit further back, we were doing some complicated songs, and people tended to go off to the bar when that happened, and we were in search of an audience, and we were racking our brains. And I said, look, what we need to get a mellotron and then a little bit later, we need to get a synthesizer. We need to be cutting edge. We need to have our own light show. We need to be able to control the environment. We need to be able to, people need to be transfixed so that all this subtle and complicated music is put over in a way where they're not aware that perhaps they're being manipulated. Now, Pete decided to personify those songs. So the term theatrical rock was being hurled at us at the time. First of all, we were considered to be art rock, then theatrical rock, and then latterly progressive prog. But it encompasses an awful lot of stuff. So the idea of Pete suddenly showing up wearing a dress and a fox's head, yep, sure. Anything that gets us a front page is good news, because it was all based largely on magazines in those days. And suddenly, we were on the front page because we were doing something that no other band was doing. And for a short while there, nothing wrong with having a gimmick. And, Hendrix set fire to the guitar, Pete wore a fox's head. But the music, of course, the same songs that died a death in front of audiences back in the day, suddenly were being revered. So it's how you frame them. Maybe it's not the picture itself, it's the frame, it's the presentation, all of those things. So, and in a way, you get to do your own marketing. I think experience bears that out. So if you can be a very focused band, and Genesis was very focused, and there was a lot of through-composed stuff. You mentioned Tony Banks, very adept at doing subtle harmonic changes with things which characterized his writing. So sometimes he would be virtuosic, other times he would be happy just to be an accompanist and to serve the best interests of the song and the music. So everything is grist for the mill with all of that.
I suppose wearing a fox hat is a whole lot easier than letting your head on fire like Arthur Brown used to do. At least there's less chance of dying in a fox head than there is setting yourself on fire.
Less chance, unless you might asphyxiate in a fox head. So he only kept it on for a very short period of time, and it does rather interfere with the singing, but Pete never let anything get in the way like that. I mean, in recent years, of course, he was seen hanging upside down singing. That was Pete. So I think he was always aware that the broad gesture, the grand gesture, was always going to get written about. So each show there would be, oh, what are you doing? You're riding a motorbike about on stage, or you're hanging upside down. But what was the music like? Well, the thing that sold the music perhaps was the other thing. What is it they talk about Hendrix? Years later, is it about his virtuosity? But it always comes down to, the guy who set his guitar on fire at the Monterey Jazz Festival. You know what I'm saying? So it's always going to be AC/DC, the guy who wears short trousers on stage. Yep, hey. At the end of the day, you still got to have the goods. There still has to be the playing. You still got to be able to write a great song and play wonderfully.
I think that does separate one band from another. I mean, there's certainly bands that got pigeonholed as being indulgent, and maybe it's because the songs didn't have that same connection to the audience. You talk about the reaction videos of some earlier Genesis songs, and it's interesting to watch people have an emotional response to something that's almost 50 years old. And there are other bands of that time where the music is cold and it doesn't have the same emotionality of it. And I think some of that has to do with not just the songwriting, but also the precision and the beauty of a guy like you and your guitar playing. That kind of puts that frosting on the cake that really makes the song either connect with somebody or run flat.
Well, I'm a detail freak, so I get very proud of certain things. The current album, which is Surrender of Silence, quite apart from Genesis, we do a track called The Devil's Cathedral, and I'm very proud of the fact that we start off with soprano sax and pipe organ, which is not a combination that most people would do. And the scales that they're doing, octatonics, it's extraordinary stuff. You don't know what scales they're doing. And it's always improvised. It's never the same every night. And then we get into the other stuff, which is very difficult to play and very, very fast, and you really have to be on your mettle to be able to do it. And it takes a few gigs to get the regiment,
Right.
really in shape to be able to do that stuff. But it means you've got a whole ensemble playing to a virtuoso standard, I think. And if you can do that, if you can get everyone playing like the killers that they are, that can really work very, very well. I think, So it borrows something from jazz. There's something from cinematic. There's something from somewhere else. I don't know. It's this X factor.
You left Genesis in 1977, and it sounds like you did it for what wound up being like purely musical reasons. That there wasn't a whole lot of animosity.
No, I did it because I wanted to be free to be able to do shows on my own and make albums on my own, and that wasn't on offer with Genesis at that time. So I think that Pete left because he wanted to do solo stuff, and the band wouldn't let him. I did an album when I was with the band. I was lucky it took off. It did very well, and but that can create problems within a band when someone starts to have successful solo stuff. But I think Genesis was in danger of hemorrhaging band members, and they realized that really they had to do solo albums for people to let off steam. And of course, Phil Collins at that time was doing Brand X, but then nobody expected him to have the enormous solo success that he had with Face Value. Phil became huge and ended up outselling the band, which is extraordinary, extraordinary state of affairs to be more famous than the band that you're actually playing in yourself. And the band was already pretty famous to start off with. So, he's done, remarkable stuff. And but so have all the guys in that band. There were no passengers in that band.
No, definitely not.
Even my predecessor, Anthony Phillips, wrote and played some really wonderful tunes with the band on the album Trespass. That's why I joined them, because I thought they were a great band to start off with.
I saw an interview that you did, and this goes back to the early '80s with Rick Wakeman. And one of the things that I just thought was really fascinating, and I've interviewed him a couple of times, and he and I have talked about this before. There's so much depth and longevity in your careers. There's so much solo work that you've done that the two of you discussed the constant comparisons of the stuff that you've spent the last 45 years working on as opposed to the 7 years you were in Genesis. And he had the same issue with Yes, this enormous body of work that followed all that, and the difficulty of constantly being in that shadow. Is that something that you felt over the years, and do you still feel that?
Well, I tell you what, I have this thing. I think I sweated blood to write those tunes in the first place with a 5-man writing team, and that isn't always easy. There's usually someone who thinks they know best. Sometimes it was me. Sometimes it would be others. And it's also difficult for singers to sing songs that are written by instrumentalists. They haven't got to reach those notes. But nonetheless, it jostles along, and sometimes you can come out with something really, really strong. But I've got no problem with doing those songs, because I know that I've worked very, very hard to make that band happen. And, with bands, you give it everything that you're allowed to give it. With a solo career, of course, you give it 100% because that's what's required of you. But I'm happy to work within a team, and I'm happy to share songwriting credits, as I did with Genesis back in those days. And but these days, I'll write with my wife, Jo. I'll write with Roger King. I'll write with other people, like I've written with Chris Squire. The Passing of Friends, of course, it's Legion. The Passing of Friends, Chris Squire, John Wetton, Ian MacDonald, who are hugely talented, who changed the shape and the course of music, and to see brothers, falling by the wayside, it's an extraordinary thing. But it's a privilege for me to still be able to get up there and do it, and the years have worn quite lightly on me by comparison. I've been very, very lucky with all these guys. We were all young blades once, and but it's great to still be doing it. Whatever I'm doing on stage, whether I'm doing songs that were written 50 years ago or 5 minutes ago, I don't see any distinction between solo and band. You know, you fight for it. You know, you'll die for it.
It's a hell of a catalog. It's 27 solo albums since over the last 45 years, and I did a little bit of math. That the Steve Hackett discography includes more albums than Phil Collins, Peter Gabriel, Mike and the Mechanics, and the post Steve Hackett Genesis combined. You've actually been perhaps the busiest of any member of that band.
And if I may say so, the amount of other people's albums that I've shown up on, doing solos for them, usually on 1 or 2 tracks, just as a guest. And I never wanted to be anyone's session man. Most of the time, I've done those as absolute favors to people, and because I know that I've had favors done for me. You know, I've been very, very lucky. I've worked with some of the best people in the business, incredible people like Richie Havens, Randy Crawford, the guys from Kansas, Steve Walsh, Phil Earhart. Incredible players and singers, and of course Peter Gabriel, Phil Collins, the most famous. But it's been extraordinary. Paul Carrack. You know, I've worked with a whole ton of people, and I realise I'm leaving out 100 other people who might be less well known, but virtuosos like the sitar player Shima Mukherjee, people from Azerbaijan, from Armenia. It's world music. I've made friends with people all over the world, and maybe they're not always, known on the international stage, perhaps. And nonetheless, these are people who've dedicated their lives and are incredible. So, world music, it's just a case of we're working with friends all over the world.
Well, Steve, I'm looking forward to the show at the Wilbur Theater in Boston. It's going to be April 2nd. It's going to be great to see Seconds Out played live in its entirety. And again, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. I wish we had more time.
Well, thanks, Mike. I've really enjoyed talking together. All the best. Thank you.
You too. Thank you, Steve. Again, Steve Hackett is going to be at the Wilbur Theater in Boston on April 2nd. Thanks for listening to Backseat's Musical Podcast, and thanks to Canna Provisions for their support. You can support them by checking out cannaprovisions.com, and you can email me at bax@rock102.com. Check out everything on social media, and we'll see you next time on Backseat's Musical Podcast.